By the 1840s, New York City had swelled to over 500,000 souls, a churning mass of immigrants and laborers crammed into tenements. The demand for cheap, daily sustenance was insatiable. Milk, that staple of childhood, became a precious commodity. To meet the need, dairymen began dragging their herds right into the heart of the metropolis, their hooves clopping over cobblestones toward a new, grim home along the East River. The cows were funneled into vast, windowless sheds that rose beside the city's booming whiskey distilleries. Inside, the air grew thick and hot, reeking of manure and damp straw. Hundreds of animals stood shoulder to shoulder in perpetual twilight, their lowing echoing off wooden beams. Just beyond the stable walls, the distillery's smokestacks belched steam, and the sweet, sour scent of fermenting grain seeped through every crack. This was an industrial marriage of convenience. The river provided transport for grain and whiskey. The city provided an endless market, and the cows, trapped in their dark pens, became the living link between the two, a source of profit waiting to be milked. No one considered what would happen when the byproduct of one industry became the sole sustenance for another. The distillery owners, always hunting for profit, saw opportunity in the steaming vats of spent grain. This hot, fermented mash, called swill, was a waste product of whiskey production. Instead of discarding it, they realized they could pipe it directly from the stills into the adjacent stables. The cows, confined in their dark pens, now had a new, constant food supply. The animals stood ankle-deep in their own excrement, their hooves softening in the muck. Twice a day, workers slopped the acidic, alcoholic swill into their troughs. The cows consumed this warm, sour slop instead of hay or grass. Their breath reeked of fermentation, and the humid air in the stable grew thick with the smell of rot and yeast. This diet was a profound shock to their systems. A cow's stomach, evolved to slowly digest fibrous plants, now processed a liquid that was essentially hot, spoiled beer. The swill provided calories, but almost none of the proper nutrients. The animals grew listless, their ribs showing through dull coats as their bodies struggled with the constant toxic insults. The consequences of that swill diet manifested in the cows themselves. Their bodies, deprived of proper nutrition, grew gaunt, their ribs pressed against their hides, and their eyes clouded with a dull, sickly sheen. Most telling was what they produced. The milk drawn from their udders was not rich and white, but a thin, watery blue. It carried a sour, unmistakably foul odour that filled the dim, stable air. In the adjacent mixing rooms, workers faced barrels of this repulsive liquid. To stretch their product, they first poured in river water, further diluting what little nutritional value remained. But the result was still a pale, unappetizing blue. So they reached for other barrels. They shoveled in white powders, plaster of Paris and chalk to add artificial body and opacity, transforming the thin fluid into a deceptively thick slurry. Finally, they stirred in dark molasses, not for sweetness but for color. The molasses masked the persistent bluish tint, blending with the chalk to create a uniform, creamy white hue. The process was one of brutal alchemy. What entered the vat was a toxic, diseased waste. What emerged was a convincing imitation of wholesome milk, ready for the city's carts. The whitened, thinned liquid was ladled from barrels into tin pails, then loaded onto carts that rattled out from the East River distilleries before dawn. Drivers navigated the dark, cobbled streets toward neighborhoods like the Five Points, where the air already hung thick with the smell of sewage and coal smoke. They knew their customers were waiting. In cramped tenement rooms, mothers handed over a few pennies for a quart, trusting the milk's creamy appearance. It cost half what pure country milk did. a crucial difference for families surviving on dock worker wages. They carried it home, unaware the chalky whiteness came from plaster, the sweetness from molasses, the thin blue liquid beneath it all from a starving, diseased cow. The milk was poured into bottles for infants or mixed into porridge for toddlers, believed to be a safe foundation for a growing child. In the summer heat of 1852 and 53, that trust would become a death sentence. The poison was not a single toxin, but a perfect storm of malnutrition, bacterial filth, and chemical adulterants sold as a staple food. In the sweltering tenements of 5 Points, the first symptoms appeared. Infants who had been thriving on country milk just months before now writhed in their mother's arms, their small bodies seized by violent watery diarrhea that soaked through cloth diapers and straw mattresses. The stench of sickness filled overcrowded rooms as mothers watched their baby's skin grow papery and tight over tiny ribs, their cries weakening to faint whimpers. Doctors summoned to these homes diagnosed cholera infantum, a wasting condition they attributed to the summer's oppressive heat or the neighborhood's foul air. They prescribed opiates to slow the bowels and brandy to stimulate strength, treatments that only further dehydrated tiny systems already ravaged by the toxic milk. The city's death registers for children under 5 began to swell with entries, page after page documenting brief lives ended by summer complaint or teething fever, euphemisms that masked the true killer. No physician yet connected the bluish milk from the distillery carts to the epidemic. The medical establishment of the 1850s lacked the tools to trace pathogens, and germ theory remained decades away. So while funeral processions for children became a daily sight in the immigrant wards, the white-coated men of science continued blaming miasmas, invisible bad airs, as the swill milk kept flowing and the tiny graves kept multiplying. As the infant death toll mounted through the summer of 1853, a young journalist named Frank Leslie decided to follow the milk carts back to their source. He slipped past the distillery gates along the East River, his notebook ready. The stench hit him first, a thick, sweet, rotten odour of fermented grain and animal waste that clung to the humid air. Inside the dimly lit stables, Leslie's eyes adjusted to a scene of profound misery. Dozens of cows stood fetlock deep in their own excrement, ribs protruding through their hides. They listlessly chewed the steaming alcoholic swill from troughs, their udders inflamed and weeping. Leslie sketched rapidly, capturing the hollow-eyed animals and the filth-smeared workers who milked them. Weeks later, Leslie's illustrated exposés exploded across the pages of his newspaper. For the first time, the public saw the stark woodcuts of those diseased cows and reeking stables. The images transformed an invisible tragedy into a visceral, undeniable scandal, forcing every reader to confront the true origin of the cheap milk feeding their children. Frank Leslie's shocking illustrations had forced the public to see the source of the milk, but the true danger remained hidden in its chemical composition. In a small laboratory cluttered with glass beakers and brass scales, Dr. E.L. Partridge, a respected analytical chemist, uncorked a sample bottle. The faint, sour odour of the swill milk filled the room as he carefully measured a portion into a porcelain dish, his first step in a forensic breakdown of the poison being sold as food. His tests revealed a liquid stripped of nourishment. Evaporation left behind a pitiful residue, proving the milk was desperately deficient in the fats and proteins essential for a growing child. Worse, his litmus paper turned a violent red, confirming high acidity from the alcoholic swill diet. Under his microscope, the slide swarmed with pus cells and bacteria, direct evidence of the diseased udders from cows standing in perpetual filth. Partridge then turned to the additives used to disguise the bluish, thin liquid. He identified plaster of Paris and chalk used for false thickness. His most damning discovery came from a spectrographic analysis, traces of lead. Distillery workers, he concluded, had been stirring the milk with paddles coated in white lead paint to improve its colour, unknowingly adding a potent neurotoxin to an already deadly cocktail of alcohol, pus and starvation. The public outcry that followed Partridge's testimony finally reached Albany. In 1864, under intense pressure from horrified citizens and reform-minded newspapers, the New York State Legislature passed an act that explicitly banned the production and sale of swill milk. The law declared these operations a public nuisance, a victory that seemed to promise an end to the poison trade. But the victory was hollow. The new statute lacked any real enforcement teeth. No dedicated inspectors were appointed, and the fines for violations were negligible. For the distillery owners, it was merely a minor business expense. Within months, they had dismantled their operations along the East River and quietly loaded their emaciated cows onto barges. The barges crossed the East River to Brooklyn, where a new industrial district welcomed them without scrutiny. There, in even larger, windowless warehouses, the familiar cycle resumed. The swill was reheated, the cows stood fetlock deep in new filth, and the bluish, adulterated milk flowed back into the city unchanged. The law had been passed, but the poison had simply moved. The Swill Milk Scandal left a deep scar, but it also sparked a scientific race for a solution. In the 1880s, a German chemist named Franz von Soxhlet, working in his Munich laboratory, became obsessed with infant mortality. He knew contaminated milk was a primary culprit. His hands moved methodically over glassware and copper tubing as he designed a device meant not for factories but for the home, a simple apparatus to heat milk to a precise temperature, just hot enough to kill the deadly bacteria without ruining the liquid. Soxhlet's invention, a small steam-heated flask system, was revolutionary. It brought the laboratory process into the kitchen. For the first time, a mother could take control of her child's safety, pouring raw milk into the device, watching it bubble gently for 30 minutes, and knowing the invisible threat of tuberculosis or diphtheria had been neutralized. The method was named pasteurization, honoring Louis Pasteur's earlier work on germ theory, and it offered a tangible shield against the chaos of the urban dairy. The idea quickly scaled. By the late 1880s, the first commercial pasteurization plants began humming in American cities like New York and Chicago. They were vast, industrial versions of Soxhlet's flask. Milk now flowed through networks of heated pipes, held at 145 degrees Fahrenheit, before being sealed into clean bottles. This was no longer a kitchen chore, but a public utility, a systematic, citywide defense built directly upon the graves of the swill milk children. The outrage over swill milk refused to fade. For decades, the scandal remained a potent symbol of corporate greed and government failure, a story parents told their children about why you couldn't trust what came in a bottle. This collective memory simmered, waiting for a new generation of reformers to harness its power. By the turn of the 20th century, a national movement was coalescing, demanding that the federal government finally step in to protect the public's plate. In Washington, a chemist named Harvey Washington Wiley had been conducting his own poison squad experiments, feeding volunteers adulterated foods to document their effects. He found powerful allies in journalists like Upton Sinclair, whose novel The Jungle exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry. Together, they framed pure food not as a local nuisance, but as a national crisis. The ghost of swill milk gave their campaign historical weight and moral urgency. That pressure finally broke the political dam. On June 30th, 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act into law. For the first time, it became illegal to manufacture or sell adulterated or misbranded food and drugs across the United States. The act created the foundation for the modern Food and Drug Administration, transforming a tragedy born in New York's distilleries into a cornerstone of American consumer protection.